They came to take a shipyard. They brought 84 warships in a plan that said 6 days. They left 20 days late with nothing to show for it but a list of names read aloud to them in the dark. The staging ground was a hollowed moon called Kesh Vault, and it was the largest quiet place in that part of space. The Kelvin Reach had been carving it out for 2 generations. Inside, the dry docks ran in 3 long arcs around a central well, and the well went down farther than the lights reached. 84 hulls sat in those arcs on the first day of the operation. 12 heavy line ships, 600 crew each. 30 medium cruisers, 220 each. 42 escorts and cutters, 60 each. 16,320 people, breathing the same recycled air, most of them thinking about food. The concourse that fed them had bad lighting and worse coffee, and a stain on the deck near the 3rd serving line that predated everyone standing in it. Nobody ever cleaned that stain. It was, by then, load-bearing in a spiritual sense. Overseer Drask stood at a viewport on the command tier and looked down into the well. He was 52 years old and had commanded in 3 campaigns, and he had never once been wrong about a thing that mattered. That is a dangerous record for a man to carry. It was not arrogance. Arrogance would have been easier to correct. It was something quieter, closer to habit, the way a man stops checking a lock he has never found unlocked. Beside him, Sub-Commander Vel held a reader and waited to be asked for it. "Confirm the count," Drask said. 84 hulls, said Vel. Fuel at 14,000 tons drawn and loaded. Ground element embarked, 2,400. Drask nodded once. He did not look at the reader. The assessment that justified all of it was 4 pages long and had been written by the Reach War Library, which meant it had been written by the warrior caste, which meant it was read by everyone. It said 3 things. It said the human war generation was gone. It said the last human combat fleet had been decommissioned 38 years earlier, at the end of the Tessel War, and that the veterans of that war were dead or dying and had been replaced by nobody. And it said the target was undefended in any meaningful sense. That last part was true. Halvern Deep, the largest shipyard outside the human core, was protected by 5 patrol cutters with 24 crew apiece. 120 people in total, standing between the Reach and 800,000 tons of hull production a year. The arithmetic was not close. It was not even interesting. What the assessment did not say, because it had never been asked, was what happened after. 7 years earlier, a Kelvain quartermaster named Tesh had filed a document with the survey library. Tesh was supply cast. Tesh counted grain and pressure suits and boot sizes and had spent 4 years attached to a trade mission in human space, doing the unglamorous arithmetic of feeding people who were not being fed by anyone in particular. The document was 18 pages. It was titled, in the flat language of the caste, "On the Behavior of Human Populations Under Occupation." It was accurate in every particular. It was never circulated. Records Warden Salk received it, logged it, and shelved it in the general holdings rather than the war holdings, because the war holdings circulated only warrior caste submissions, and because a supply clerk's paper appearing in the reading queue would have raised a question about how his section sorted things. It was not malice. It was career. It is almost always career. Nobody read it. Not the analysts, not the planners, not Drask, not Vel, not the archivist who dusted the shelf it sat on for 7 years. The last line of that document was 6 words long, and it would eventually be read aloud in a room aboard a Kelvain flagship by a man who had built his entire operation on not having read it. Count the hands, not the hulls. On the command tier, Drask turned from the viewport. Below him, a loading crew was walking a heavy pallet across the deck with a bent guide rail that had been reported 4 times and repaired never. He watched them route around it without thinking. Everyone routed around it. It had been there so long that the route around it was simply the route. "Overseer," said Val quietly. He had a way of leading with the title when he was about to say something he did not want on his own record. "Overseer, may I raise one item?" "Raise it," said Drask. "The population figure," said Vel, 2,400,000 across the system. Our ground element is 2,400. That is one soldier for 1,000 people." Drask asked what the figure had been at Ordum. Vel said 1 to 800. Drask asked whether Ordum had given them any trouble. Vel said it had not. "That is because occupation is not a fight," Drask said. "It is an arrangement. People go to work. They go to work under us instead of under someone else. And in a year they cannot remember which year the flag changed." He said it without cruelty, and he said it without any doubt at all. And the thing that should be understood is that he had been right about it every previous time. He did not know, and nobody on his side had yet discovered, that the population of the Halvern system had a peculiarity that had never appeared in any Reach document, because it was not a military fact, and no military reader had ever gone looking. 61% of the working adults in that system were employed, directly or through a contract, by the yard itself. Not by a government, not by a corporation with an office somewhere else. By the yard. They knew each other's shifts. They knew each other's children. They had a word for the count of people on a job, an old dockside word that had come out of wet harbors on Earth and never been retired. And they used it 40 times a day without hearing it. On the first day of the operation, Drask gave the order to proceed. It was one sentence, and it was recorded, and it was not memorable in the slightest. "Move them out," he said. 3 days later, and 420 light-years away, a woman named Anna Reyes stood in a corridor outside the Halvern assembly chamber with a folder under her arm and rehearsed a sentence she had already rehearsed 11 times. She was 58. She had been a lieutenant once on a supply frigate at the tail end of the Texel War, which meant she had seen exactly nothing and had spent the whole conflict counting crates. Now she was harbor master at Halvern Deep, which meant she decided who docked where and at what hour, and it meant she looked at traffic patterns for 6 hours a day, every day, for 22 years. The folder held 9 weeks of traffic anomalies. Reyes had noticed, the way a person notices a smell before they can name it, that the commercial hauls out of the Kelvain frontier had stopped being random. Reaction mass purchases at 3 neutral depots had tripled and then stopped entirely. 2 Kelvain survey ships had run the same approach corridor 4 times in 6 weeks and had each time turned back at exactly the same distance, which is the behavior of a vessel measuring something rather than looking at it. And a Kelvain freight broker who had bought Halvern parts for 11 years had, in the space of 1 month, paid off every outstanding invoice he owed. Nobody pays their debts before nothing happens. The chamber was small and warm and smelled of the carpet. Administrator Voss chaired. Counselor Weber sat to his left with a reader and the expression of a man who had already read the agenda and made his peace with it. Reyes was given 6 minutes. She used 4. She put the traffic charts on the wall display and walked through them without adjectives, because she had learned somewhere that adjectives were what people used when the numbers did not carry. She ended with a sentence she had rehearsed. "The yard is not a fortress, it is a workforce." 10 words. Voss thanked her. Weber asked the first question, which was whether any of this had been confirmed by the Colonial Office. It had not. Weber asked the second question, which was whether the Colonial Office had been asked. It had, twice, in writing. Weber asked the third question, which was whether the Colonial Office had responded. Reyes said that it had responded to acknowledge receipt. Weber said that acknowledgement was, at least, a form of attention. Nobody laughed, which was the correct response, because it had not been a joke. Then Weber did the thing that would be examined, later, by people who had nothing to do with it, in reports that Weber himself would never see. He did not reject her petition. Rejecting it would have required a vote, and a vote would have required the chamber to have an opinion. He proposed instead that the matter be referred, in full, and with the harbor master's commendation entered, to the Standing Committee on Frontier Assurance, which existed precisely for questions of this kind, and which contained members with a technical background that this chamber, he said frankly, did not. It was a generous speech. It was procedurally impeccable. Voss called the vote. It carried without opposition. Rhea stood there with her folder while a clerk logged the referral, and she asked the only question she had left. "When does that committee sit?" she asked. The clerk checked. The Standing Committee on Frontier Assurance sat quarterly. Its next sitting fell on the 62nd day of the calendar quarter. 58 days away. Rhea said thank you. She went back to the harbor office, and she did not throw anything, and she did not resign, and she did not tell anyone at home. She sat down in front of the traffic board and looked at the same 4 anomalies she had been looking at for 9 weeks. And she started a second folder, because the first one was now the property of a committee. That is the part people never understand about institutions. They imagine the villain who says no. There is almost never a villain who says no. There is a courteous man with a reader who says that this deserves a better hearing than we can give it here. And he is sincere, and he is even correct, and the hearing is in 58 days. 2 floors down, Yard Superintendent Tom Hale had heard about the referral within the hour, because Halvern Deep was a place where everything was known within the hour. He was 61, and he had run the yard for 9 years, and he had a habit of not saying much in the first minute of any conversation. He kept a drawer in his desk with almost nothing in it, a pen that no longer worked, a brass dock tag with his father's crew number stamped on it, from a yard on Earth that had been closed since before Hale was born. He opened the drawer roughly twice a year. He opened it that afternoon, looked at the tag, and shut it again. Then he called Reyes and asked her to send him the second folder, the one that was not the property of anybody. "What do you want me to do with it?" she asked. "Nothing yet," Hale said. "I want to know what you know." That is not the same as doing something. Reyes sent it. Hale read it twice. Then he did the thing that would matter, and he did it so quietly that no record of it exists except a work order. He instructed the yard's berthing office to keep 8 of the outer docks empty for the next month, listing the reason as scheduled survey. It cost the yard money. It generated 1 complaint from a freight consortium. He signed the complaint response himself and did not explain. On the 10th day, the Kelvain force crossed the marker line, which was the agreed boundary of human space in that region, and had held for 38 years without anybody testing it. Nothing happened when they crossed it. That is what a boundary is, in the end. A place where nothing happens until somebody decides otherwise. 3 days later, they arrived at Halvern. The 5 patrol cutters went out to meet them, because that is what 5 patrol cutters do. Their senior officer was a commander named Ito, who had spent his career doing customs inspections and had never fired a shot at anything that could fire back. He put his boats between the Kelvain line and the yard, and he transmitted a formal challenge in the clear, and then he held station, which was the bravest thing anyone did that day and the least effective. It took 35 minutes. The cutters were not destroyed in a battle. They were removed the way a hand removes an insect from a table, without malice and without effort. And the Kelvain gunnery officers logged the engagement in the same tone they used for calibration runs. 120 people. That figure would be restated many times over the following weeks, and it never got smaller, and it never stopped meaning what it meant. Aboard the flagship, Drask watched the plot clear and asked for the yard's response. There was no response. The yard had not armed. The yard had not evacuated. The yard had, according to the intercepted traffic, continued its shift change on schedule at the 16th hour. Vel brought that detail to him personally because he did not know what to do with it. "They changed shift," Vel said. Drask asked what that meant. "It means the second shift went to work," said Vel. "Good," said Drask. "That is exactly what we want." And on paper, he was right. In practice, something had started that no plan in the reach could price. The first refusal happened at the 4th hour of the occupation and involved a man with no rank whatsoever. His name was Yusuf Bala. He was 34 and he flew a yard tug, which is a small, ugly vessel whose entire purpose is to push things heavier than itself. Bala had 11 years on tugs and a reputation for being slow to answer the radio. A Kelvain escort, the Vresh, 60 crew, was assigned to take berth 28 and open it as a landing point for the ground element. Berth 28 was full. It held a half-finished ore carrier on cradles. The Kelvain hailed the yard and ordered the berth cleared, and the yard's berthing office, which was one woman and a headset, routed the order to the tug pool, and the tug pool routed it to Bala, because Bala was on the board. Bala listened to the order twice. Then he keyed his microphone and said the thing that would be quoted in that system for the rest of his life. "That's a live cradle," he said. "I'm not pushing it." There was a pause. The Kelvain officer restated the order and added the consequence, which was clear and which Bala understood completely. Bala said he understood. Then he shut down his engine, vented his working gas, and sat in the dark with his hands in his lap, 400 meters from a warship, and did nothing at all. He was not brave in any way he could have described. He would say later, when people asked, that he had simply looked at the cradle and looked at the ship and decided he did not feel like it. That was, he insisted for the rest of his life, the entire content of the decision. The Vresh's captain, an efficient officer named Korin, made the reasonable choice. He could not shoot the tug without shooting toward the cradle, and the cradle held the hull they had come to take. So he brought the Vresh in himself, nose to the berth, and put out a boarding ramp to walk a party across and clear it by hand. It was the correct move. It was also, though nobody aboard knew it, the last correct move that ship ever made. Because berth 28, at that hour, on that shift, held 206 shipfitters, welders, and cradle crew who had not been told to go home by anybody. And when the ramp came out, they came down it. Not in a charge. Nobody charged. They walked, in coveralls, carrying nothing that would have registered as a weapon on any Kelvain scan. Because they were carrying the tools they had been holding when the ramp opened. And a cradle crew's tools are heavy for reasons that have nothing to do with war. 60 Kelvain in a corridor built for 2 abreast, against a number that kept increasing behind the first ones, because the shift changed at the 16th hour, and the incoming shift walked straight past the lockers and into the ramp. At the 18th hour, the Vresh stopped answering. Her last transmission was 3 seconds of open microphone and one word that the flagship's translators marked as incomplete. On the plot, her icon stayed exactly where it was. Drask stood over it for a long time and asked for a status, and was told the vessel appeared undamaged, and asked again for a status, and was told the same thing in different words. The Vresh had not been destroyed. Nobody could tell him what had happened to her instead. In the yard superintendent's office, at the 20th hour of the first day, 4 people sat around a table with a pot of coffee that had been made at noon. Hale, Reyes, a woman named Mira Okan, 86 years old, retired chief engineer, who had come because nobody had thought to stop her, and a night controller named Joe Vance, 27, who was there because she had been on shift when it started and had not left. Hale did the thing he always did, which was to say nothing for a minute. Then he looked at Reyes. "Tell me the honest number," he said. Reyes had it ready. 5 cutters gone, she said. 120 people. 84 hulls in our orbit, of which we can identify 12 as heavy line. Ground element estimated at 2,400. Station reserves for the habitat rings, at current draw, 110 days. We have no fleet. We have no orbital defense. We have 460 pressure-rated hulls in the yard basin, of which none are armed, and 6,313 registered civilian craft in this system, of which the largest carries ore. She stopped. Then she added the part that was not a number. "We cannot win a fight," she said. "Not one that looks like a fight." Nobody said anything for a moment. The coffee was terrible. Okan poured herself some anyway, and drank it, and made a face, and drank the rest. Hale asked the next question. "What do they need from us?" he asked. Reyes said it plainly. "They need the yard working." They came 420 light years for 800,000 tons of hull a year, and that number is not the docks. That number is the people who know which valve sticks. And there it was, on the table, in a room with bad coffee and a lift outside the door that had squeaked for 6 years. Okan set down her cup. "I've got a question," she said. Everyone waited. "How many hands can we put inside those rings by Thursday?" she asked. Vance, who was the youngest person in the room by 30 years, said the thing that got written down. "Depends what we ask them to do," she said. "If we ask them to fight, a few hundred. If we ask them to show up, everybody." Hale looked at the table for a while. Then he said the 2 words that people in that system would repeat to each other for the next 25 days. In lifts, in galleys, on radio channels, in the dark. "Not yet," he said. He explained it once and never again. He said they had exactly one thing that Kelvain could not model, and the moment they used it early, it would stop working. He said that if 3,000 people stood in a dock tomorrow, the Kelvain would learn the shape of the problem while it was still small enough to solve. He said the only version of this that worked was the version where the number was already too large to arrest before anyone noticed it existed. Then he told them to go home and sleep, which nobody did. Downstairs, at the 2nd hour of the 2nd day, a welder named Sam O'Day came off shift in Ring 2. He was 46. He had worked at Halvern Deep for 23 years, and he had a daughter studying on Kessel, and a habit of leaving his cup on top of the locker instead of in it. There was a tally sheet taped to the locker door, the kind used for equipment checkout, with a marker on a string. Somebody had written a heading on it in yard marker, and nobody ever found out who. It said in block letters, "Who came?" O'Day stood in front of it with his helmet under his arm. He set his cup down on top of the locker. He picked up the marker. He wrote his name, first line, no comment, and hung the marker back on its string and picked up his cup and went to catch the lift. He did not tell anyone he had done it. He did not mention it that night at home or at any point in the following 25 days. And 8 years later, when a journalist with a recorder asked him what he had been thinking when he wrote it, he said he had been thinking that he was going to miss the lift. By the end of that shift, there were 14 names on the sheet. By the following morning, there were 312. On that sheet and 4 others like it, in 3 rings in the transit hub, and the berthing office had started keeping a copy because the berthing office kept copies of everything. That was the first count, 312. Meanwhile, in a maintenance gallery 2 kilometers from anywhere important, Mira Okan walked a route she had walked every week for 31 years. At the end of it was a hatch, and behind the hatch was the number 2 reactor of a decommissioned battleship, and the reactor was warm. She had kept it warm since 2473. It was logged every quarter, without exception, as heater maintenance, preservation of museum asset. It was not heater maintenance. It was a reactor at 7%, drawing station power, held at temperature because a woman who had been the ship's chief engineer at the age of 53 could not physically make herself let it go cold. 22 yard directors had approved that line item across 3 decades without once asking what it was. She put her hand on the casing the way she always did. "She still holds air," Okan said, to nobody. That was the vow. There was no ceremony attached to it. Nothing about the 3rd day was dramatic, and that was the problem. The Kelvain ground element came down into the yard rings expecting resistance and found a functioning industrial habitat where every person they passed nodded politely and went where they were going. The Kelvain officers reported the situation as compliant. Vel read the report twice and did not like it, and could not say why in a way that would survive being written down. Nobody was hostile. Nobody was cooperative either. Machines ran, nothing was produced. On the fourth day, the yard's primary hull line completed 0 tons of work, and the shift supervisor filed the daily report on time, and the report said that the line had been down for a bearing fault. On the fifth day, the same. On the sixth day, the bearing was replaced, and the line ran for 2 hours and stopped for a lubricant fault. Every fault was real. Every fault was documented. Every repair was performed correctly and slowly by people who had been repairing that equipment for 2 decades and who knew, to the minute, how long a repair could honestly take. The Kelvain sent an engineering officer to observe. He watched a 4-man crew replace a seal for 6 hours and reported accurately that they were competent and thorough. Drask's schedule said 6 days. On the 6th day, the ledger of the operation read as follows. Fuel expended, 4,100 tons of 14,000. Hulls on station, 83 of 84. Production restored, 0. Casualties, 60 missing aboard a vessel that was still, according to every sensor they had, structurally intact and sitting exactly where they had left it. Vell drafted the first escalation to the high table himself. It was 3 paragraphs. It stated the position without excuse, and it requested either a revision of the timetable or an increase in the ground element. The reply came in 14 hours. Noted and held, it said. There was more, but that was the operative content. 6 days later, he sent the second, longer, with the production figures attached. The reply asked him to submit a revised completion estimate in the standard format, and reminded him that revised estimates were to be filed no later than the 10th day of the quarter. Vell sat with that for a while. Then he filed the revised estimate in the standard format, because he was a professional and because there was nothing else to do with it. Down in the rings, the attrition was not military. That was what made it invisible. A Kelvain patrol of 6 entered Ring 3 at the 9th hour and found the corridor full of people going to a shift, and stood aside, because 6 people do not push through 400. Another patrol tried and got as far as pushing 1 man, a fitter named Cho, into a bulkhead. Nobody hit anybody. The corridor simply stopped moving entirely in both directions for 40 minutes, and then resumed when the patrol left. No injuries, no report. Cho's shoulder hurt for a week. In the transit hub, the Kelvain seized the lift control room, which was correct doctrine, and discovered that the lifts had been run manually by call-out for 6 years because the automation had never worked properly and nobody had bothered to fix it. They had captured a room with a broken system in it. The manual call-outs were made by 4 dispatchers who were somewhere else and who could not be found because the yard's own directory was, like most yard directories, out of date by 2 years. The Kelvain requisitioned the yard's administrative offices and were given them, immediately and with every courtesy, along with a filing system that had been designed in 2461 and modified continuously by people who had all since retired. On the 15th day, the ground commander requested restraints for detention of non-compliant workers. The ground element had brought 300 sets. The brig aboard the flagship held 45. The count in the rings that morning, by the berthing office's own copy of the sheets, was 4,700. It is the sort of thing that reads as comedy at a distance and does not feel like comedy in the room. A commander with 300 restraints looking at 4,700 names is not embarrassed. He is doing arithmetic, and the arithmetic is telling him something about the shape of the next month, and he does not like it. On the 17th day, a Kelvain cutter attempted to board an ore hauler that had drifted into a restricted lane. The hauler's crew of 5 did not resist. They opened the hatches, stood aside, and answered every question. The cutter's boarding party spent 2 hours confirming the vessel was empty of anything interesting, and then found that their own docking clamp would not release because a shipfitter had, at some point in those 2 hours, walked past and closed a manual isolation valve on the clamp's hydraulic line. One valve, turned by hand, by a person nobody could identify afterward, because everyone in a yard wears the same coveralls, and because 5 people confessed to it and at least 4 of them were lying. The cutter was immobile for 19 hours. In that time, it was not attacked. It was simply, in the flat language of the later report, obstructed. Vell brought the pattern to Drask on the 18th day. He had built the case carefully because he intended to survive it. Overseer, he said, 18 days, 0 tons. We have lost 1 escort we cannot explain and had 6 vessels obstructed. Our fuel is at 7,800 tons of 14,000. Drask asked whether he was recommending withdrawal. Vell said he was recommending an assessment. Drask said, an assessment of what? Of whether the thing we are doing is the thing we think we are doing, said Vell. It was the best sentence anyone on that side spoke in the whole campaign, and it went nowhere because Drask was standing at a viewport at the time, looking down at a yard where every light was on and every dock was lit and nothing was moving, and finding for the first time in his career that an ordinary industrial view looked different than it had a week ago. He said they would continue. Force leader Rek, who commanded the ground element, listened to that decision on a repeater and drew the conclusion he had been waiting to draw. He had spent 18 days being polite to people who nodded at him. He filed a proposal for what he called demonstrative action, meaning a strike on an occupied habitat section, and it was refused by Drask in writing, in 1 line, without discussion. Rek kept the refusal. He read it more than once. By the 20th day, the count on the sheets was 34,000. In a room on the 3rd sub-level of the traffic control tower, at 3 in the morning of the 20th day, 4 people were failing at the same problem. The room had 1 working overhead panel, a cold air return that whistled, and a whiteboard that had been mounted crooked in 2489 and never straightened. Joe Vance was there. So were 2 controllers off shift and a signals technician named Petra Ling, who had been awake for 26 hours. The problem was reach. Halvern Deep is 1 station. The system is not. There were people on the 2 inner moons, in the belt camps, on 460 ore haulers strung out along the mining lanes, and every one of them had heard something, and none of them had been told anything. The muster sheets were physical, taped to lockers, and physical does not cross 100 million kilometers. The old civilian emergency ban, which everyone called the Marlin ban because of a wreck nobody remembered, had been jammed by the Kelvain on the 2nd day. Not out of cleverness, out of doctrine. Vance had spent 4 nights trying to find a transmission window and had found none. At 3 in the morning, she stood up and walked to the crooked whiteboard and said the sentence that broke it. "We've been thinking about this wrong," she said. "We keep trying to transmit. We should be trying to be read." She wiped the board. Then she wrote 2 words on it: birth schedule. The Halvern birth schedule was a commercial feed. It listed every dock assignment in the yard basin, updated 4 times a day, and it went out unencrypted to every hauler, broker, insurer, and supplier in the system, because it always had, because commerce runs on knowing where a ship will be. The Kelvain were not jamming it. The Kelvain were reading it, in fact, because it told them where the hulls were. Nobody jams the price of freight. Ling saw it first. "Berth numbers," she said. Vance nodded. 6 digits per assignment, 4 updates a day. Every hauler master in this system reads that feed with breakfast, and has since they were apprentices. The code was not clever. Clever would have failed. They used the one thing every yard worker in that system had memorized as a child, which was the old cradle numbering, retired in 2470, in which the first 2 digits gave a ring and the last gave a shift hour. A berth assignment that could not physically exist, listing a cradle that had not existed for 34 years, was a message. The content it could carry was tiny: a date, a ring, an hour. That was all it needed to carry. Vance took it to Hale at 4 in the morning. He listened to the whole thing, standing up, with his coffee, and asked one question. If they read it, he asked, how long before they understand it? Ling said, a week, if they were good. Hale looked at the board for a long moment. Then he said it again. Not yet, he said. He held it 4 more days. In those 4 days, 3 things happened that mattered. Mira Okan took an apprentice, 16 years old, named Tam Bell, down into the maintenance gallery and taught him one thing. Not the theory, one valve. She put his hands on the manual bypass for the number 2 feed and made him crank it open and closed 40 times until his forearms shook, and told him the count, which was 14 turns to open and 11 to seat, and told him that if he ever had to do it, he would not be able to see the gauge and would have to count. Bell asked her, "Why him?" She said, "Because you'll be here in 50 years and I won't." Then she put her hand on the casing. "She still holds air," she said. Second, the Kelvain found the Vresh. She had been drifting since the first day, and on the 21st day, a recovery team finally boarded her. What they found was not wreckage in any sense they had a word for. Her hull was unbreached. Her weapons had never fired. Every hatch had been opened from the inside. Her crew of 60 was accounted for, alive, all of them, sitting in the yard's own transit dormitory, eating the yard's own food, having been fed 3 meals a day for 20 days by a kitchen crew who had asked nobody's permission. Her log ended with an entry that was not in Kelvain. It had been written by hand, in marker, on the log casing itself. Berth 28, secured. Day 1, Bala. And on the outside of the hull, in yard primer, in letters 4 meters tall, somebody had painted a number where the recovery team's lights would fall on it first. 34,000. The recovery officer photographed it and sent it up and asked what it meant. And the flagship's analysis section spent 11 hours on it and concluded in writing that it was most likely a unit designation. Third, on the night of the 21st day, an old transponder woke up. It appeared on the Kelvain plot at the 22nd hour as a new contact in the museum basin, where nothing had moved in decades. Mass reading, 480,000 tons. Length, 780 meters. The identification code returned from the Reach's own commercial database with a single line of description. Museum vessel, non-operational. The duty officer stared at it for a full minute before he called Vel, because he did not want to be the man who woke the subcommander over a museum. By then she had already begun to move. Her name was Ardent. She had been launched in 2298 from a yard in Earth orbit that no longer existed, and she was 206 years old, and she was the oldest human battleship anywhere, and she had been a tourist attraction since 2473. School children had eaten lunch on her flag bridge. There was a gift counter in her forward magazine. She had 4 main mounts, of which 2 had ever been restored to working condition, and she carried, at the 22nd hour of the 21st day, 2,180 people. 96 of them were veterans of the Texel War. Out of 148 still living in that system, average age 82. The oldest was a gunner's mate named Dove Sarno, 88, who had been a mount captain on that exact ship in 2465, and who had to be helped up the ladder to the position he then held for the next 2.5 hours without sitting down. The youngest was Tam Bell, 16. The other 2,084 were ore haulers, teachers, fitters, cooks, a lift mechanic, a woman who ran a laundry in Ring 4, and 410 people who had simply been on the muster sheets and had gone where the marker on the string had told them to go. They had trained for 8 days. It was not enough, and everyone aboard knew it was not enough. Reactor 2 came up in 50 minutes. It came up in 50 minutes instead of 6 weeks because it had never been allowed to go cold, because a woman had walked 2 kilometers every week for 31 years and filed it as heater maintenance. Mira Okan was in the engineering space when it lit, sitting on a stool, with her hands flat on her knees. She did not say anything. Somebody else said something, and she did not hear it. "They came for us," she said, once, quietly, to nobody. Then she stood up and started giving orders in a voice that had been giving orders in that compartment before most of the people receiving them were born. What Arden did was not complicated. She put herself between the Kelvain line and the evacuation lanes over Ring 4 and Ring 6, and she stayed there. That was the entire tactic. Aboard the flagship, Drask looked at the contact and asked the question everyone later remembered him asking, because the flag bridge recorder caught it. "I know what that is," he said. "I did not know they had it." Vel said correctly that they did not have it. They had a museum. The first Kelvain salvo hit her at the 23rd hour. Arden's armor belt was 400 years out of date in concept, and 1 meter thick in fact, and the modern rounds went through it in places and stopped in it in others, in a pattern nobody could predict because nobody had shot at that kind of steel in a very long time. She burned. She kept station. Her 2 working mounts fired 46 rounds over the next 2 hours in 20 minutes. Old rounds from her own magazines, at ranges her fire control had been designed for and her enemies had stopped thinking about. 3 Kelvain hulls died. A medium cruiser lost its bow. An escort came apart. A second escort took a hit amidships and went dark and stayed dark. Nobody on Arden cheered. There is a persistent idea that people cheer at moments like that. On the recorder for 2.5 hours, there is almost no talking at all. There is Sarno calling corrections in a voice like gravel. There is a damage controlman named Weiss saying compartment numbers over and over, flatly, until he stops. There is Tam Bell at the 41st minute in a gallery with no lights and no gauge, counting out loud. 14 turns to open, 11 to seat, and then at the 2nd hour, there is the sound of 2,000 people not saying anything while the ship shakes. She held the lane. That was the whole of it. 61,000 people came out of Rings 4 and 6 along that lane in ferries, tugs, ore boats, and anything that would hold pressure. And they came out because for 2 hours and 20 minutes, the largest guns in that system were pointed somewhere else. And then the rest of them answered. It began at the 1st hour of the 22nd day, and it took under 4 minutes. Every civilian transponder in the Halvern system came on at once. Not a few, everyone. 6,313 registered hulls, plus an unknown number of unregistered belt boats that had never carried a transponder in their lives, and were now visible because they were burning drive plumes. Ore haulers from the outer lanes, ferries, survey boats, 240 tugs, a grain transport with a crew of 3 and a cargo of nothing 6 days out from where it should have been, because its master had read the berth schedule with his breakfast on the 21st day and had seen a cradle number that had not existed since 2470. On the Kelvain plot, it looked like the system had caught fire. The analysis section reported 6,000 contacts and could not classify them because they were not classifiable. They were not warships. They were not decoys. They were people going somewhere. "Orders," said Vel. Drask did not answer right away. "Confirm the count," he said. 6,313, said the duty officer. "Sir, they are not maneuvering to engage. They are maneuvering to arrive." And in the rings, the count on the sheets that morning was 126,000. That is a number, and numbers go past people. So it should be said plainly. 126,000 people in a system of 2,400,000 is better than 1 in 20. And in a yard town, it means the man who fixes the lifts, and the woman who teaches the 8-year-olds, and both of Sam O'Day's neighbors, and the neighbors on either side of them. It means the person who takes the tickets at the museum, standing in a dock, in the same shoes they wear every day. Force leader Rek watched his own plot fill and made the decision Drask had refused him in writing on the 18th day. He had 2,400 soldiers and 126,000 civilians, and a corridor system he could no longer move through, and he decided that what the situation required was a demonstration. He ordered a single main battery strike on Ring 4 at the docking gallery, where the plot showed the highest density. He did not consult. The order took 11 seconds to transmit, and the round took 40 seconds to arrive. Drask's counterman was given 36 seconds after Rex's order, from a flag bridge 200 kilometers away, by a man who had understood what was about to happen the instant he saw the firing solution appear. "Break it off," Drask said. "Do not fire into the rings." It arrived 4 seconds late. 1,286 people died in the Ring 4 docking gallery. The recording of Drask's countermand exists. It was played later in a room, and he did not ask for it to be stopped. On the 23rd day, nothing was produced, nothing was gained, and nothing moved. Drask ordered the honest assessment at the 4th hour of the 24th day. He asked for it in the plainest language available to him, which was itself a kind of confession. "I want to know what we are actually inside of," he said, "not what we planned to be inside of." The analysis section came back in 6 hours with a document that answered the wrong question, because it was staffed by people trained to count hulls. Vell read it and sent it back. Then Vell did the thing that ended his career and probably saved 4,000 lives, which was to walk down to the logistics deck and ask a supply cast quartermaster a question. Tesh was 59 years old, had been in the Reach service for 31 years, and had never once been asked into an operational compartment. Tesh listened to the question. Then Tesh said that a document already existed and had existed for 7 years, and gave the shelf reference. It took 2 hours to find because the general holdings were not indexed the way the war holdings were. At the 14th hour of the 24th day, in the flag conference space, with the door shut and no aides present, Overseer Drask read, "On the behavior of human populations under occupation," 18 pages, aloud, because Vell had asked him to hear it rather than skim it. It described, 7 years in advance, what a human industrial population does when its workplace is seized. It said they will not fight for the place. It said they will come to the place. It said the arriving force will be unable to distinguish between a worker and a combatant because the distinction will not exist, and will be unable to use its weapons because the object it came for is made of the people it would have to shoot. It gave numbers. It estimated participation in a mature yard system at between 4 and 8% of total population within 20 days. The actual figure on the 24th day was 5.25%, and it ended with 6 words: "Count the hands, not the hulls." Drask put the document down. "Who read this?" he asked. "Nobody," said Tesh. Drask asked who had decided that. "Nobody decided it, Overseer," said Tesh. "It went to the general holdings. The war holdings take submissions from the warcast. I am supply. It is not a rule anyone wrote. It is simply how the shelves are arranged." The silence in that compartment ran, by the recorder, for 51 seconds. Then they laid out the options, and they took them apart one at a time, and it was the most professional hour of work anyone on that side did in the entire operation. Option 1, escalate. Destroy the rings, take the docks, hold the yard by force. Vell did the arithmetic aloud. The yard is worth 800,000 tons a year because of the people in those rings. Destroy them, and the Reach owns a very large empty building 420 light-years from home. Rejected. Option 2, mass detention. 2,400 soldiers, 300 restraints, 45 brig spaces, 126,000 people. Rejected in under a minute, and not on moral grounds, which Vell noted in his log and which bothered him for the rest of his life. Option 3, wait them out. Station reserves in the habitat rings were 110 days. Kelvain fuel on the 24th day stood at 2,900 tons of 14,000. Rejected by subtraction. Option 4, target the leadership. Analysis had identified a yard superintendent named Hale as the coordinating authority. Tesh spoke, uninvited, for the second time in 31 years of service. "He is not the reason," Tesh said. "He is the address. If you remove him, the sheets on the lockers do not change." Rejected. Option 5. Negotiate. Drask asked what there was to negotiate for, and Vel said the sentence he had been building toward for 24 days, in a room with the door shut, which is where the truth in institutions usually gets said. Overseer, said Vel, we came here believing that people are what you get with a place. It appears the place is what you get with the people, and we have taken the place. He did not raise his voice. He never did. Drask stood at the viewport of the flag conference space and looked down at Halvern Deep, at the lit docks in the still cranes, and the 6,000 small drives holding position around it in no formation any academy would recognize, and found that an ordinary industrial view looked entirely different than it had on the 13th day. Somewhere down there, a woman had been reading the same 4 traffic anomalies for 9 weeks before any of this started, and had said 10 words to a chamber that had voted, unanimously and with her commendation entered, to refer them to a committee. The message went out at the 20th hour of the 24th day, in the clear, on the yard's own commercial frequency, because it was the only channel the Kelvain were certain would be read. It was addressed to the yard superintendent, Halvern Deep. It said one thing: we request to talk. The talks took place on the 25th day in the yard's own arbitration room, which was used ordinarily for disputes about overtime. It had a laminate table with a burn mark near one corner, 11 chairs of 2 different types, and a wall clock that ran 4 minutes fast and had run 4 minutes fast since before anyone in the room started working there. Drask brought Vel and Tesh. Hale brought Reyes and Okan. Nobody brought a recording device, and then everybody agreed to a recording device, and a yard clerk set one on the table and started it. Drask opened by conceding the things that could be conceded because he was a professional. He offered a full withdrawal beyond the marker line within 72 hours. He offered the return of all seized administrative systems. He offered restitution for the Ring 4 gallery in tonnage of refined metal at a figure his logistics officer had computed and which was, by any standard, generous. He offered the surrender of Force Leader Rek to human jurisdiction. 4 things offered cheerfully in 11 minutes. Hale accepted the first 2, declined the 4th, and did not respond to the 3rd at all. Reyes asked a single question about the withdrawal timetable and got an answer she could work with. Then the room went quiet in the way rooms do when the small business is finished. Drask asked what the yard wanted, and Hale, who had said almost nothing for 2 days, opened the folder in front of him. It contained a photograph of a locker door with a sheet of paper taped to it. "What we want," said Hale, "is the names." He explained it in flat language. 3,842 people from this system are dead. 4,318 of yours are dead. We want every one of them read aloud, on the record, in your chamber and in ours. And we want the document containing them filed in the holdings that get read, not the general holdings, the ones your officers are required to read. Vel understood first, and his face did something it had not done in 25 days. Drask asked whether that was all. Hale said that was all. Drask said that his government would offer considerably more, including terms on the yard's output that would be worth a great deal to this system for a generation, in exchange for the removal of that one item. He was not being cynical. He was being accurate about what his government would prefer. It was, everyone in that room agreed afterward, the most courteous refusal any of them had ever heard. "No," said Hale. That afternoon, in an office with the door shut and no aides and no recorder, Drask and Hale sat alone for 20 minutes. This is the only place in the whole account where the thing itself was said out loud. Drask asked why the names. He said that reading names changes nothing. He said the dead were dead and the metal was real and the metal would feed children. Hale did not answer right away. Then he said that a document had come to this system's assembly on the 3rd day and had been referred courteously, unanimously, with a commendation to a committee that sat on the 62nd day. He said that a document had sat on a shelf in the Reach for 7 years because of who wrote it. He said the two failures were the same failure. He said that the only thing that had ever killed anyone in this whole business was a piece of paper nobody was required to read. Then he said the part that Val wrote down that night from memory. "You can pay us in metal, and your officers will never know this happened," said Hale. "Put the names where your officers have to read them, and in 30 years a man like you will be sitting where you are sitting, and he will have read them, and he will do the arithmetic differently. That is the only thing I can buy here that outlives me." Drass said that terms outlive the people who sign them. Hale said that was the entire idea. They signed on the evening of the 25th day. There was no ceremony. The clerk printed 3 copies on the arbitration room's own printer, which jammed once. Hale signed with a pen borrowed from Reyes, because the pen in his drawer had not worked in years. Then he did the thing that the yard talked about afterward more than the signing. He had the locker door brought up from ring 2. The actual door, unbolted from its frame, with the tally sheet still taped to it and the marker still hanging on its string, and a ring of coffee on the top edge where a man had set his cup down on the second day. He handed it across the laminate table to Drask, and Drask took it with both hands because it was a door and it was heavy. Nobody said anything at all. On the 26th day, the Kelvain force withdrew beyond the marker line. 67 hulls of 84, 14,402 people of 18,720. Their fuel state on departure was 600 tons. Nobody in the Halvern system celebrated, and it is worth being specific about why. Ring 4's docking gallery was still open to vacuum and would be for 11 months. The yard's #1 hull line did not restart until the following year. There were 4,000 people in temporary housing on the inner moon, and 182 children in that system who had lost both parents in the same 40 seconds. And the ore lanes did not run for a season, which meant the belt camps went hungry in a way that does not photograph. And Ardent was still up there, burned through in 11 places, holding station where she had stopped, with 617 people still aboard who could not be brought down yet. She still held air. That was, in the end, the only thing anyone could say about her, and people said it and meant several different things by it. On the 62nd day, the Standing Committee on Frontier Assurance sat, as scheduled, quarterly, in a warm room with carpet. The referral from the Halvern Assembly was on its list. The chair called the item. A clerk noted that the matter had been overtaken by events and asked whether the committee wished to receive the harbor master in person. There was a brief discussion about whether that was necessary. It was determined that it was not. The item was marked closed, with the harbor master's commendation entered a second time. Anna Reyes was not present. She was at the yard working because the traffic board does not run itself. Somebody sent her the minutes. She read them once. Then she filed them because she filed everything. The ripples went outward for years, the way they do, and none of them were dramatic. 2 neutral systems on the Kelvain frontier quietly renewed defense agreements they had let lapse. 3 shipping consortiums rewrote their occupation risk clauses, adding a factor for what the underwriters started calling workforce density, which is an insurance term meaning people who will not leave. Inside the Reach itself, the supply cast submitted 41 documents to the war holdings in the following 2 years, and the war holdings, under a new sorting rule, read all of them. Records Warden Salk was not punished. He was moved to a section with better offices and no shelves. Force Leader Rek was tried by his own service and reduced in rank and kept the written refusal Drask had given him on the 18th day. He read it many times over the following years. He concluded, every time, that he had been the only one in that fleet willing to act. He was still saying so at 60. Some people are a category, not a person. 8 years later, in 2512, a journalist named Grace Pham came to the Halvern system with a recorder and a list of 40 questions, and got answers to about 6 of them. She found Yusuf Bala flying the same tug on the same board, slow to answer the radio. She asked him about berth 28, and he said it was a live cradle, and he had not felt like pushing it. And when she pushed, he said it again in almost the same words, and then asked if she wanted coffee. She found Tam Bell, 24, third shift engineer, who could still recite 14 to open and 11 to seat, and who took her down 2 kilometers to a gallery to show her a reactor casing with a handprint worn into the paint. She found Sam O'Day on a scaffold in Ring 2 and asked him what he had been thinking when he wrote his name first, and he told her he had been thinking about the lift. She asked him 3 different ways. He gave her the same answer 3 times, not evasively, but because it was true. She found Tom Hale retired, 69, with a drawer containing a broken pen and a brass dock tag. She asked him the question she had come 420 light years to ask, which was what single decision had changed everything. Hale thought about it for a while. Then he said that he had made no decision that mattered, and that the first name on that sheet went up at the 2nd hour of the 2nd day, before he had given a single instruction to anybody, and that everything he did afterward was traffic management. She asked whether he was being modest. He said he was being accurate, and that people always wanted the story to have a man in it who decided, and that in this case there had not been one. She found Mira Ocon in a kitchen on the Inner Moon, 94, with a hearing aid she refused to wear and a note stuck to her cold box in her own handwriting, reminding her to take a pill she had taken at the same hour every day for a decade. Ocon made tea badly and talked about the reactor for an hour, and would not talk about the 50 minutes at all. When Pham asked what she had felt when it lit, Ocon said she had felt that she needed to stand up, and that her legs had taken a moment to agree. And she found Tesh, who had left the Reach service, in a small office where Tesh now taught cargo mathematics to 17-year-olds. Pham asked the obvious question. She asked whether being right had been worth anything. Tesh did not answer right away. Then Tesh said that 4,318 people from the Reach were dead, and that the document had been finished 7 years before any of them died, and that it had been 18 pages, and that the shelf it sat on had been dusted every week. Being right about a bad thing is not winning, Tesh said. It is just knowing sooner. Ana Reyes did not talk to Pham for long. She was 72 by then and still at the yard 3 days a week. Pham asked her whether she was bitter about the committee. Reyes said she had thought about it for 8 years and had decided the committee was not the problem, and that Weber had been sincere, and that a sincere referral to a competent body is a perfectly reasonable thing that killed 120 people. Then she said the only bitter sentence she ever said on any record. Nobody read it, she said, not mine either. The reading is held every year on the 22nd day at Halvern Deep in the repaired gallery in Ring 4, and it takes 2 nights. The first night is the Halvern Dead, 3,842 names, read in the order the roll was signed, at 4 seconds a name, which comes to a little over 4 hours and 16 minutes. The second night is the Kelvain Dead, 4,318 names, a little under 4 hours and 48 minutes, read by a human, in Kelvain, badly, which was the one term Drask asked for in return and got. The document sits in the Reach War Holdings, in the section officers are required to read, and it has been read, in full, by every serving Kelvain officer above ship rank for 8 years. That was the price. Nobody has ever been able to say what it bought, which is generally the case with the things that are worth the most. On the 8th reading, in 2512, Grace Pham sat in the 4th row with her recorder off, because she had asked and been told she could attend but not record. The gallery holds 1,100. It was full, and there were people standing in the transit corridor outside, and the yard ran a reduced shift that night, which it does not do for anything else. Ana Reyes had read the names the first year and every year after, and this year she sat with her hands in her lap and let a young engineer do it. He was 24. He had been 16 on the day, in a gallery with no lights, counting out loud. He read for 4 hours in 16 minutes without sitting down, and his voice went at the third hour, and nobody helped him, because that is not how it is done. Sam O'Day stood at the back, 64 years old, holding his helmet under his arm because he had come straight off shift. His name was not read. His name was the first line on the roll, and he had come home. The last name on the first night belonged to a woman called Prisha Nayar, an ore hauler out of the belt camps, who had signed the sheet at the 22nd hour of the 22nd day and had been dead 40 minutes later, and whose signature is the last one on the original document, which is a locker door, which hangs in the Kelvain war holdings 420 light-years away, with a ring of coffee on its top edge. They came to take a shipyard. They counted the hulls in it, and the guns, in the years since anyone had fought, and every number they had was correct. They never counted the hands. Count the hands.